The Grand Assembly Hall of the Galactic Council stretched across 3 kilometers of polished crystal and floating platforms, suspended in the void of space, and Ambassador Claire Martinez stood in the center of it all, feeling very small and very alone, as 12 alien species looked down at her with expressions that ranged from contempt to outright hostility, and the largest of them all was Supreme Commander Zarketh of the Kronar Empire, whose scales gleamed like burnished copper under the harsh lights of the chamber, and his voice boomed through the translators with a sound like grinding metal. Earth had 30 days to surrender its sovereignty and submit to council rule or face what Zarketh called corrective military action, and Claire knew that was just a polite way of saying they would destroy every city, every ship, every trace of human civilization, until nothing remained but ash and memories. And the worst part was that Earth had no real way to fight back, because humanity had only been traveling between stars for 50 years, while the youngest race on the council had been doing it for over 2,000, and the math was simple and brutal and completely hopeless. On the far side of the moon, hidden in a crater that most humans had forgotten existed, there was an observation post that nobody knew about, except for one person, and that person was not human at all, despite how human she looked. And her name was Lysandra, and she had been watching Earth for longer than any human civilization had existed. And she had violet eyes that seemed to hold entire galaxies within them, and right now those eyes were fixed on the council proceedings with an intensity that would have made Zarketh very nervous if he had known about it. Beside her, curled in a space that should not have been able to contain something so large, was Emberwing, and he was a dragon in the truest sense of the word, though no human mythology had ever quite captured what that meant. And his scales shifted through colors that did not exist in normal physics, moving from deep crimson to shades of purple that hurt to look at. And he was utterly silent despite his massive size, and when he breathed, the air around him seemed to ripple and distort, as though reality itself was uncertain about how to handle his presence. Lysandra reached out and placed one slender hand on Emberwing's flank and felt the ancient warmth that radiated from him, and she whispered in a language that had not been spoken in 10,000 years that the time was coming soon, and Emberwing opened one eye that was larger than Lysandra's entire body, and the understanding that passed between them needed no words, because they had been together since before Earth had learned to dream. And they had made a promise long ago that this world and its people would never fall to the kind of arrogance that had destroyed their own civilization. Captain Nicole Hayes stood on the bridge of Defense Station Sentinel-7 and watched the tactical display with growing dread, because the numbers were impossible to argue with, and Earth had 37 warships of various sizes and capabilities, while the Galactic Council was bringing over 3,000 ships, and that did not count their support vessels or their planet-killer weapons, or the fact that every single one of their ships was more advanced than anything humanity had ever built, and she was responsible for coordinating Earth's defense, which felt like being asked to stop an ocean with a paper cup. The crew around her worked with quiet efficiency, but Nicole could see the fear in their eyes, and she did not blame them because this was not a battle. This was an execution, and everyone knew it, but they were going to do their jobs anyway because that was what humans did when faced with impossible odds, and Nicole felt a strange pride mixed with her fear, because even though they were probably going to die, they were going to make the council work for it. Dr. Amy Foster was 3 kilometers below the surface of the Pacific Ocean in a submersible that creaked ominously with every movement, and she was staring at something that should not exist, and could not exist, but very clearly did exist, and it was a structure made of materials that her instruments could not identify, covered in symbols that appeared in every human culture throughout history, and the symbols were glowing with a soft blue light that was getting brighter with each passing hour. And Amy had been a xenoarchaeologist for 15 years, and she had never seen anything remotely like this. She took samples and photographs and measurements, but nothing made sense because the structure was old, incredibly old. possibly older than human civilization itself, but the technology inside it was more advanced than anything the Galactic Council possessed, and there were power readings coming from deep within the structure that suggested it was waking up after a very long sleep. And Amy felt her scientific curiosity warring with a deep primal fear, because whatever this thing was, it had been built by someone who understood physics in ways that modern science could not even imagine. The military response was immediate and predictable, and within 6 hours of Amy's report, the site was classified at the highest possible level, and submarines carrying elite teams were descending to investigate, and General Patricia Wells, who was coordinating the global defense effort, looked at the data from the Pacific structure and then looked at similar reports coming in from the Sahara Desert, from the Amazon rainforest, from Antarctica, from dozens of locations around the globe, and she realized that Earth was covered in these things, and they were all waking up at the same time. Back in the observation post on the moon, Lysandra smiled for the first time in centuries, and it was not a kind smile, and she spoke to Emberwing in that ancient language, and said that the defense network was responding exactly as designed, and that the Council had made a terrible mistake by threatening Earth because they did not understand what they were threatening, and Emberwing made a sound that was somewhere between a purr and a growl, and the walls of the observation post vibrated with harmonics that should have shattered the structure, but instead seemed to make it stronger. The Council fleet began its approach, and Supreme Commander Zarketh stood on the bridge of his flagship watching Earth grow larger on the view screen, and he felt nothing but contempt for this primitive world and its primitive people, and he had destroyed 17 civilizations in his career, and Earth would be number 18, and it would barely take a week, and then he could go home and receive his honors and his promotion, and never think about these humans again. What Zarketh did not know was that Earth had never been undefended, and that it had never been unguarded, and that there was someone watching him right now who had been preparing for this moment for 10,000 years, and who had the power to turn his fleet into scattered atoms with less effort than it took him to breathe, and that someone was getting ready to introduce herself in a way that the Galactic Council would never forget. As the 30-day deadline began its countdown, humanity prepared for war in the only way they knew how, and they built more weapons, and they trained more soldiers, and they said goodbye to their families, and they made peace with whatever gods they believed in, and they waited but deep beneath the oceans, and buried in the deserts, and hidden in the frozen wastelands. Ancient machines were humming to life, and a network that had been dormant for millennia was stretching and yawning and remembering its purpose. On the final day before the deadline expired, Lysandra stepped out of her observation post and stood on the lunar surface without a suit or protection of any kind, and the vacuum did not harm her, and the radiation did not touch her, and she looked up at Earth hanging in the void like a blue jewel, and she whispered that she was sorry it had come to this, but that she had made a promise and she intended to keep it. Then she reached out with her mind and touched the defense network that she had built so long ago, and the network responded with joy because it knew its creator, and it had been waiting for her call, and across Earth every ancient structure flared with brilliant light and power readings, spiked to levels that shattered measurement instruments, and General Patricia Wells received reports from every major nation on Earth, simultaneously, all saying the same thing, that something vast and powerful had just awakened, and it was on their side. Lysandra opened a communication channel directly to Admiral Kate Morrison, who commanded the UNS Defiance, which was Earth's flagship and the most powerful warship humanity had ever built, though it was still pathetically weak compared to Council vessels. And Lysandra's voice came through crystal clear, despite the fact that she was transmitting from the moon without any visible equipment, and she said only 7 words. But they were 7 words that changed everything. She said that she was Earth's first and last line of defense, and that it was time the galaxy remembered why they should fear this world, and Admiral Morrison, who had spent 30 years in the military and thought she had seen everything, felt her blood run cold, because there was something in that voice that spoke of vast age and terrible power and absolute certainty. The Galactic Council fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of Earth's solar system, and Zarketh gave the order to advance, and 3,000 warships began their final approach toward a world they intended to conquer. And they had no idea that they were flying straight into a trap that had been set before their civilizations had even learned to make fire. Admiral Kate Morrison was reviewing tactical displays when every alarm on the bridge of the UNS Defiance began screaming at once, and Lieutenant Maya Collins shouted that something had just materialized in the center of the command deck, and Morrison spun around with her hand on her sidearm and found herself staring at a woman who should not exist, standing calmly in the middle of her bridge as though she had always been there. The woman was tall and slender with features that were almost human, but not quite, because her eyes were too large and too violet, and her ears came to subtle points, and she wore armor that seemed to be made of liquid starlight. And she looked at Morrison with an expression that combined ancient wisdom with something that might have been amusement, and she introduced herself as Lysandra and said that they needed to talk. Morrison demanded to know how this person had bypassed every security system on the most advanced warship humanity possessed, and Lysandra simply smiled and said that she had built the fundamental principles of quantum encryption about 7,000 years before humans had discovered fire, and that their security was adorable, but not particularly effective, and Morrison felt her jaw clench because this stranger had just insulted Earth's entire technological base while standing uninvited on her bridge. But before Morrison could respond, the tactical officer shouted that something massive had just appeared next to the ship, and the external cameras showed a creature that defied every law of physics and biology that humanity understood. And it was a dragon, and not the fairy tale kind, but something far older and far more terrifying, and its body stretched for over a kilometer, and its scales shifted through impossible colors, and when it moved, the stars behind it seemed to bend and distort. Lysandra gestured toward the dragon with casual affection and introduced him as Emberwing, and explained that he was her companion and her friend, and that together they had been protecting Earth for longer than human recorded history, and Morrison looked from the elf to the dragon and back again, and felt reality tilting sideways, because this was not possible, and could not be real. But every instrument on her ship was confirming that both beings existed, and that they were giving off energy readings that made her reactors look like birthday candles. Commander Sophie Blake, who led the Defiance's Marine contingent, stepped forward and asked the question everyone was thinking, which was why they should believe anything. This stranger said, and Lysandra did not look offended by the skepticism, and instead she simply raised one hand, and the entire bridge crew suddenly found themselves looking at images that played directly in their minds, and they saw Earth as it had been 10,000 years ago, covered in ice and barely inhabited, and they saw Lysandra arriving with Emberwing, fleeing from a war that had consumed dimensions, and they saw her making a choice to stay and to protect this world and its potential. The images showed Lysandra guiding early humans, teaching them subtle things, never interfering directly, but always watching and protecting, and they saw her fighting off threats that humanity had never known existed, and threats from the stars, and threats from other dimensions, and threats from things that had no name, and she had done it all in silence and in secret, because humanity needed to grow on its own without becoming dependent on a guardian. They did not know they had Morrison, felt the images fade, and she looked at Lysandra with new eyes, because if even half of what she had just seen was true, then this being had shaped human history in ways that no one had ever suspected. And Lysandra confirmed that yes, she had been there at key moments, always in the background, always hidden, and that she had watched civilizations rise and fall, and had seen humanity stumble and learn and grow into something remarkable. Lieutenant Maya Collins, who specialized in xenotechnology, asked about the structures that were waking up all over Earth, and Lysandra explained that those were nodes in a defense network that she had built millennia ago, and that they were designed to protect the planet from exactly the kind of threat that the Galactic Council represented, and that they drew power from Earth's magnetic field and from the quantum foam of space itself, and that when fully activated they could generate shields that would make the planet effectively invulnerable. But Blake was not satisfied, and she asked the hard question, which was what Lysandra wanted in return, because in her experience, nobody protected anything for free, and there was always a price, and Lysandra looked at the Marine commander with something like respect and said that she wanted nothing except for humanity to survive and to thrive because she had made mistakes in her past and her own people had fallen to arrogance and pride, and she would not allow Earth to follow the same path. The conversation was interrupted by urgent alerts from the tactical station because the Galactic Council had sent a forward assault group to probe Earth's defenses, and they were already entering weapons range, and Morrison immediately moved to coordinate a response. But Lysandra held up one hand and said that she would handle this and that humanity should watch and learn what it meant to have a real Guardian. Morrison wanted to argue, but something in Lysandra's eyes stopped her, and instead she ordered her crew to observe and record everything, and Lysandra simply nodded, and then she was gone, vanishing from the bridge without any visible means of transportation, and external cameras showed her reappearing in the void between the Defiance and the incoming council ships, and she was not wearing a spacesuit and she was not using any visible propulsion, but she hung there in space as easily as if she were standing on solid ground. Emberwing appeared beside her, his massive form dwarfing even the largest council warships, and the dragon opened his mouth and released something that was not fire and was not energy, but was somehow both and neither, and the forward council ships simply ceased to exist, and there was no explosion and no debris, and they were just gone, as if they had never been there at all, and the remaining ships in the assault group tried to turn and flee, but Lysandra was faster. She moved through space like a dancer, and where she moved, council ships died, and her movements were so fast that human cameras could barely track them, and she carried a blade that glowed with inner light, and when it touched council shields, those shields shattered like glass, and when it touched council hulls, those hulls opened like paper. And behind her, Emberwing roared, and the sound of it traveled through space. Despite the vacuum, and every ship within 1,000 kilometers felt their systems begin to fail. The battle lasted exactly 4 minutes and 17 seconds, and when it was over, 23 council warships had been reduced to scattered atoms, and not a single one had managed to fire a shot, and Lysandra returned to the bridge of the Defiance, and she was not even breathing hard, and she asked Morrison if that demonstration had been sufficient. The bridge crew was silent and stunned, because they had just watched one person and one dragon destroy a force that would have taken Earth's entire fleet hours to defeat, if they could defeat it at all. And Morrison found her voice and asked why Lysandra had held back, because it was obvious that she had not used her full power, and the elf smiled sadly and said that if she showed them what she could really do, their son might not survive the collateral damage. Dr. Amy Foster arrived on the Defiance an hour later, and she had been studying the data from the ancient structures, and she had questions and theories and a desperate need to understand what was happening, and Lysandra sat with her in the science lab and answered what questions she could, and confirmed that yes, the structures were her work, and yes, they were connected to every major advancement in human history, and yes, they had been influencing human development in subtle ways for thousands of years. Amy asked why Lysandra had revealed herself now, after so long in hiding, and the elf explained that the Galactic Council represented an extinction-level threat, and that her directive had always been to remain hidden unless humanity faced complete annihilation, and that threshold had been crossed the moment the Council issued their ultimatum. And now that she had revealed herself, there was no going back, and the galaxy would have to deal with the fact that Earth was not undefended. President Linda Carter called an emergency meeting of every world leader and every military Commander and Lysandra attended via hologram and answered their questions with patience that spoke of vast age, and she explained that she could protect Earth from the Council, but that humanity would need to decide whether they wanted her help, because accepting it would mean admitting that they were not alone and had never been alone, and that their entire history had been shaped by outside influence. Senator Victoria Hayes argued passionately against accepting Lysandra's help because she said it would make humanity dependent on a power they did not understand and could not control, and that it would doom any chance of true independence. And General Patricia Wells argued just as passionately that refusing help in the face of certain extinction was not independence, it was suicide, and that they could worry about the philosophical implications after they survived. The debate raged for hours while the Council fleet drew closer, and Morrison watched from her bridge and wondered what humanity would decide, and whether they would choose pride over survival. And Lysandra sat in the observation post on the moon with Emberwing and waited patiently, because she had been waiting for 10,000 years, and she could wait a little longer. In the end, it was President Carter who made the decision, and she spoke directly to Lysandra and said that humanity accepted her protection, but that they would fight alongside her, not hide behind her, because humans did not surrender their agency, even to save their lives. And Lysandra smiled genuinely for the first time since arriving on the Defiance and said that was exactly the answer she had hoped to hear. Supreme Commander Zarketh stood in his command center aboard the flagship Absolute Dominion and watched the footage of his forward assault group being destroyed, and he refused to believe what his eyes were showing him. Because one warrior and one creature, no matter how powerful, could not possibly threaten a fleet that had conquered hundreds of worlds and subjugated dozens of species. And his tactical officers were telling him that their sensors had recorded energy outputs that exceeded theoretical maximums. But Zarketh dismissed it as sensor errors or human tricks, or anything except the obvious truth. The Council had gathered via holographic conference, and the representatives of 12 species argued among themselves about how to respond, and some suggested negotiation, while others called for immediate withdrawal. But Zarketh argued loudest of all that showing weakness now would undermine the Council's authority across the entire galaxy, and that if they allowed one primitive world to defy them, then others would follow, and the Council needed to demonstrate overwhelming force, not just to destroy Earth, but to send a message to every other species that might consider resistance. The vote was close, but Zarketh won, and the Council authorized the deployment of weapons that were banned by their own laws, because the destruction of Earth had become about more than one planet, and it had become about maintaining the illusion of invincibility that the Council relied upon, and so they prepared planet-cracking missiles that could shatter worlds, and biological weapons that could sterilize entire biospheres, and reality distortion bombs that could unmake matter at the quantum level. On Earth, humanity unified in ways that had never happened before. And ancient enemies put aside their differences, because when facing extinction from outside, all internal conflicts seemed small and petty, and General Patricia Wells found herself coordinating with military leaders from nations that her own country had been fighting proxy wars with just months earlier. And the cooperation was awkward and sometimes tense, but it was real and it was effective. Lieutenant Maya Collins led teams to the ancient defense nodes that Lysandra had mapped across the globe, and the teams worked around the clock to activate systems that they did not fully understand, following instructions that Lysandra provided remotely, and as each node came online, Earth's electromagnetic field began to pulse with protective energy, and scientists detected patterns in the field that suggested intelligence and purpose, and Dr. Amy Foster theorized that the nodes were not just machines, but something more organic, something that could think and adapt. The nodes responded to human presence in unexpected ways, and Maya reported that when her team entered the structure in the Amazon, it had reconfigured itself to provide comfortable working conditions and had displayed information in English, even though the symbols on the walls were far older than any human language, and it was as if the structure recognized them as the people it had been built to protect. and was trying to help them understand. Meanwhile, Amy had made a breakthrough in translating the ancient texts found within the Pacific structure, and what she discovered made her blood run cold, because the texts spoke of the Watcher and the Flame made flesh, and described them in terms that perfectly matched Lysandra and Emberwing. And the texts said that they would stand between humanity and darkness, but the texts also mentioned a terrible cost and a price that had to be paid, and Amy could not decipher what that price was. But she felt growing dread as she worked. Captain Nicole Hayes, who commanded Defense Station Sentinel-7, received new orders to integrate her systems with the ancient defense network, and when the connection was made, she felt something vast and aware touch her mind briefly, and it was not hostile, but it was utterly alien and completely overwhelming, and when the connection ended, she found that she understood how to operate weapon systems that should have taken years to learn, and her crew reported similar experiences, and suddenly Earth's pitiful fleet was being enhanced by technology that made them far more dangerous. Commander Sophie Blake volunteered to lead a delegation to meet with Lysandra in person on the lunar observation post because Blake did not trust communications that could be intercepted, and she needed to look the elf in the eyes and ask the hard questions that no one else seemed willing to ask. And Lysandra agreed, and Blake found herself standing in a structure that should not exist, looking at a being who had watched civilizations rise and fall. Blake asked Lysandra about her past, and the elf seemed surprised by the directness of the question. But after a long silence, she began to speak, and she told Blake about an empire that had spanned dimensions, and about a people who had grown arrogant and cruel, and about how they had tried to conquer beings who existed beyond normal space and time, and how those beings had struck back with terrible precision and scattered her empire across the multiverse and left only her and Emberwing as survivors, and prisoners and guardians. The elf explained that she had been bound to Earth as punishment and penance, and that she was required to protect this world and its people until humanity either destroyed itself through its own choices or evolved into something worthy of joining the greater galactic community. And she said that she had watched humans make terrible mistakes and commit horrible atrocities, but she had also watched them show compassion and creativity and courage, and that she had come to believe that humanity was worth saving, not because she was required to, but because she wanted to. Blake asked if Lysandra had ever considered that humans might not want to be protected by someone who was essentially serving a sentence, and the elf smiled grimly and said that she had considered it often, and that was why she had remained hidden for so long, and why she had only revealed herself when the alternative was total extinction, and that if humanity survived this war, she would offer to leave and to take her influence with her and let them forge their own path. The conversation was interrupted by urgent alerts because the main council fleet had arrived, and Supreme Commander Zarketh was broadcasting a message to Earth and demanding that humanity surrender Lysandra and Emberwing and submit to council authority or watch their planet die. And to prove his seriousness, Zarketh ordered his fleet to target Mars' moon. Phobos and 20 council warships fired simultaneously, and the moon that had orbited Mars for billions of years simply ceased to exist. On Earth, people watched in horror as Phobos was destroyed, and they understood that the Council had weapons that could do the same to their world, and President Linda Carter prepared to make a speech that would either rally humanity or send them into panic. But before she could speak, something unexpected happened, and the ancient defense network responded to the threat, and massive energy spires began emerging from Earth's oceans and deserts and mountains. The spires were kilometers tall and made of materials that shimmered with inner light, and they rose into the sky like fingers reaching toward space. And Admiral Kate Morrison received readings that made no sense because the spires were drawing power directly from Earth's core and from the quantum vacuum of space itself, and were generating shields that wrapped around the entire planet. And when the shields activated, they glowed with soft blue light. And every instrument on every council ship detected them and calculated that breaking through would require more firepower than the entire fleet possessed. Zarketh stared at the readings and felt something he had not felt in decades, which was genuine fear because this should not be possible, and no planet should be able to defend itself like this. And his tactical officers were telling him that the shields were not just strong, they were adaptive, and they were learning from council weapons and growing stronger with each passing moment, and that meant the longer the fleet waited, the harder breaking through would become. Lysandra appeared on the bridge of the Defiance, and she was standing beside Emberwing, who had somehow compressed himself down to fit within the command deck, and the dragon was radiating heat that made the environmental systems struggle. And Lysandra looked at Morrison and said something that made the Admiral smile, and she said that the Council had just made the planet angry and that what came next would not be pleasant for them. Dr. Amy Foster burst into the science lab where she had been working, and she was carrying data tablets covered in translations, and she shouted for someone to contact Lysandra immediately because she had discovered something critical in the ancient texts. And when the elf appeared, Amy explained that the texts described Lysandra not as immortal, but as slowly dying, and that every use of her power burned away part of her life force, and that protecting Earth was consuming her one day at a time. Lysandra did not deny it, and when Morrison demanded to know if it was true, the elf simply nodded and said that she had been dying for 10,000 years, and that it was an acceptable price for keeping her promise. And Emberwing made a sound that was filled with ancient sorrow, because he too was fading, and they had both known from the beginning that their vigil would eventually kill them. But they had chosen to pay that price anyway. The revelation sent shock waves through Earth's leadership, because they suddenly understood that their mysterious guardian was not an all-powerful deity, but a mortal being who had been sacrificing herself for millennia to protect people she had no obligation to save. And President Carter spoke directly to Lysandra and asked why she would do this. And the elf said simply that she had failed her own people through arrogance and would not fail humanity the same way. In orbit above Earth, the Council fleet prepared for their final assault, and Zarketh gave orders to deploy every weapon they possessed simultaneously, because he had decided that if they could not conquer Earth, they would at least make sure no one else could either, and 3,000 warships armed weapons that could crack planets and sterilize worlds. And the countdown began toward an attack that would either break Earth's shields or doom the Council fleet to defeat and disgrace, and everyone on both sides knew that the real war was about to begin. The Council fleet fired first, and 3,000 warships unleashed enough destructive power to shatter continents and boil oceans, and the energy beams and missiles and reality-distorting weapons streaked toward Earth in a wave of annihilation that lit up space like a dying star, and every human on the planet held their breath waiting for the end, and then the ancient defense network responded. The pod energy spires that had risen from Earth's surface blazed with brilliant light, and the shields surrounding the planet absorbed the incoming fire without even flickering. And then something impossible happened because the spires began firing back, and beams of pure energy lanced out from Earth and bent space itself as they traveled. And they struck Council ships that were light years away with perfect accuracy, and those ships simply vanished, consumed by power that exceeded anything the galaxy had ever seen. Admiral Kate Morrison watched from the bridge of the UNS Defiance as the defense network fought with precision that no computer could match, and she realized that Lysandra had not just built weapons. She had built something that could think and adapt and learn, and the network was analyzing Council tactics in real time and countering them before they were even fully executed, and the Council fleet that had seemed invincible minutes ago was now being systematically destroyed. Lysandra stood beside Morrison, and her eyes glowed with violet fire as she directed the defense network through a connection that existed beyond normal physics. And Emberwing had launched into space and grown to his full size, and the dragon was moving through the Council fleet like a force of nature, and where he passed, ships broke apart, and weapons failed, and crew members found themselves questioning why they were fighting at all, because the dragon's presence affected minds as much as matter. Commander Sophie Blake led boarding parties onto disabled council ships, and her Marines moved with skill and courage that impressed even themselves, because they were enhanced by the defense network in ways they did not fully understand, and they captured technology and intelligence and prisoners, and Blake coordinated the operations with efficiency that would have made career officers jealous, and she realized that humanity was not just surviving, they were winning. Pilot Christine Murphy flew her fighter through the battle with reflexes that exceeded human norms, because the defense network had touched her mind and shown her how to see patterns in the chaos, and her small craft danced between council weapons that should have vaporized her, and she destroyed ships that were 10 times her size, and when her squadron mates asked how she was doing it, she could not explain except to say that she knew where the enemy would be before they got there. On the Council flagship, Supreme Commander Zarketh watched his fleet being torn apart and felt rage and disbelief, warring within him, because this was not supposed to happen, and primitive worlds did not fight back like this, and single guardians did not destroy armadas that had conquered the galaxy, and he gave orders to deploy the forbidden weapons because if he was going to lose, he would make sure Earth paid the highest price possible. The planet-cracking missiles launched, and they were designed to burrow into a world's core and detonate in a way that would shatter the entire planet from within. And they moved faster than light and should have been impossible to intercept, but Lysandra simply raised one hand, and the missiles stopped in space as if they had hit an invisible wall, and then they turned around and accelerated back toward the Council fleet. And Zarketh barely had time to scream orders before his own weapons struck his own ships. Emberwing roared, and the sound of it propagated through dimensions that humans could not perceive, and council ships throughout the solar system felt their power systems fail simultaneously, and crews found themselves unable to remember why they were fighting, and some ships simply shut down and drifted while others tried to flee, and the dragon pursued them with relentless efficiency, and his breath unmade matter at the quantum level, leaving nothing behind but empty space. Dr. Amy Foster worked frantically in her lab because she had discovered more disturbing information in the ancient texts, and she learned that Lysandra was not just dying. Slowly, she was dying exponentially, and that each major use of her power accelerated the process. And this battle was consuming years of her remaining life with every minute that passed, and Amy tried to contact Morrison to warn her, but communications were chaos, and by the time she got through the battle, had already escalated beyond anything they had imagined. General Patricia Wells coordinated Earth's unified military forces with precision that came from decades of experience, and she watched as human ships enhanced by the defense network fought alongside Lysandra and Emberwing, and she saw something she had never expected to see, which was humanity standing equal to a galactic power, and not through technology alone, but through courage and determination, and the willingness to stand beside their guardian rather than hide behind her. Lieutenant Maya Collins was inside the Amazon defense node when it suddenly went active in ways she had not seen before, and the structure began channeling enormous amounts of power, and Maya realized that the node was preparing for something big, and she tried to evacuate her team, but the structure would not let them leave, and instead it showed them images directly in their minds, and they saw what Lysandra was planning, and they understood that the battle was about to reach its climax. On the lunar observation post where Lysandra had lived for 10,000 years, there were records written in languages that predated the universe, and those records spoke of the ultimate defense that Earth possessed. And it was not a weapon in the traditional sense, but rather a conversion system that could take incoming destructive energy and redirect it anywhere in space or time, and it required enormous power to activate, and the cost of using it would be measured in lifetimes. Lysandra felt the defense network ready itself, and she knew that the Council was preparing to use their reality. Distortion bombs, which were weapons so terrible that even thinking about them was dangerous, because they could unmake entire sections of space and everything in them, and if those bombs detonated near Earth, the ancient shields would not be enough, and billions would die, and she could not allow that to happen. She reached out to Emberwing through their ancient bond and asked him if he was ready, and the dragon responded with feelings rather than words, because they had been together so long that language was unnecessary, and he was ready, and he understood what they had to do, and that it would likely kill them both. But that was acceptable because protecting Earth had always been worth any price. The reality distortion bombs launched, and they were not like other weapons because they did not travel through normal space, and instead they moved through the underlying quantum foam, and they would detonate in multiple dimensions simultaneously and erase Earth from existence across all possible timelines. And Zarketh watched them deploy and felt grim satisfaction because even if his fleet was destroyed, at least these primitives would not survive to threaten Council authority. But Lysandra and Emberwing had been waiting for exactly this moment, and they moved to intercept the bombs not in normal space, but in the dimension where the bombs were traveling, and what happened next could not be adequately described in human language because it involved physics that Earth science had not yet discovered and energies that should not exist in a stable universe. The elf and her dragon caught the reality distortion bombs before they could detonate, and Lysandra began absorbing their energy directly into her own body, and the pain of it was beyond anything she had experienced in 10,000 years, because the bombs were designed to unmake reality, and channeling that power was like drinking liquid fire. But she held on, and Emberwing wrapped himself around her and added his own strength to hers. On Earth, every defense node blazed with light so bright it could be seen from orbit, and the network channeled all of its accumulated power toward Lysandra, and billions of humans who did not fully understand what was happening felt a pull on their consciousness, and instinctively they gave their will and their strength and their determination to live, and it flowed through the network and into their guardian. Admiral Morrison watched on her screens as Lysandra's body became a living star, and the elf was glowing with power that made her sensors overload, and Emberwing was doing the same, and together they were holding energy that could destroy galaxies. And Morrison realized with sudden clarity that they were not witnessing a battle. They were witnessing a sacrifice, and she shouted for someone to do something, but there was nothing humanity could do except watch and hope. President Linda Carter broadcast a message to every human on Earth and in space, and she told them what was happening, and she asked them to focus their thoughts on Lysandra and Emberwing, and to give them whatever strength humans could give, and billions of people stopped what they were doing, and they focused and they willed their guardian to survive, and the collective consciousness of humanity flowed through the defense network like a river of light. In space, Lysandra felt that support, and it shocked her because she had expected to face this moment alone, as she had faced every critical moment for 10,000 years. But instead, she felt billions of minds touching hers and lending her their strength, and she realized that humanity was not hiding behind her. They were standing with her, and for the first time in millennia, she did not feel alone. With a sound that shook dimensions, Lysandra redirected the energy from the reality distortion bombs, and instead of erasing Earth, she aimed it at the Council fleet. And then she did something that shocked everyone, including Zarketh, because she did not destroy the fleet. She shielded it, and she wrapped every Council ship in protective barriers that saved them from their own weapons, and the bombs that should have killed billions detonated harmlessly in the void between galaxies. The war ended in that moment because the Council could not fight an enemy who had just saved them from their own ultimate weapons. Supreme Commander Zarketh stood on his bridge staring at tactical displays that showed his entire fleet intact and functional when they should have been scattered atoms across multiple dimensions, and he could not comprehend what had just happened, because the enemy he had tried to annihilate had instead saved him and his crews and his ships, and the cognitive dissonance was so extreme that he actually stumbled and had to catch himself on a console. His communications officer reported that they were receiving a transmission from Earth, and Zarketh almost ordered it ignored, but something made him accept it. And Admiral Kate Morrison appeared on his view screen, and her expression was not triumphant or gloating, but rather tired and sad, and she said that Earth was offering terms of peace, and that the Council had one chance to accept them or face consequences that would make what they had just witnessed seem merciful. Behind Morrison stood Lysandra, and the elf was clearly weakened because her glow had faded and she was leaning on Emberwing for support, and the dragon looked diminished as well. But their eyes still held power that made Zarketh's scales itch with instinctive fear. And Lysandra spoke directly to him and said that she had shown mercy, because that was what humanity had taught her, and that if the Council could not learn from this lesson, then the next one would be far more permanent. The Council convened in emergency session, and for the first time in their long history, they were facing a situation where they had been completely outmatched and utterly humiliated, and worse than that, they owed their survival to the very species they had tried to destroy, and some representatives argued for continued resistance while others called for immediate surrender, but most were simply silent and shocked. On Earth, President Linda Carter addressed her world, and she spoke with pride about how humanity had stood together and fought alongside their guardian, and she revealed everything about Lysandra and the ancient defense network and the 10,000-year vigil, and people reacted with amazement and gratitude and a determination to never take their freedom for granted. Again, Dr. Amy Foster finally reached Lysandra, and she demanded to know the cost of what the elf had just done, and Lysandra admitted that redirecting the reality distortion bombs had consumed centuries of her remaining life, and that she had perhaps a few decades left instead of millennia. And Amy felt tears streaming down her face because this being had just spent most of her remaining existence to save a species that was not even her own. But Lysandra smiled and touched Amy's shoulder, and said that something unexpected had happened, because when humanity had channeled their collective will through the defense network, it had renewed her binding to Earth, and instead of it being a prison sentence, it had become a partnership, and the energy that humans had freely given had stabilized both her and Emberwing, and while they were still dying, it was now a slow fade instead of a rapid collapse. Commander Sophie Blake organized the formal peace negotiations, and she insisted that they take place on neutral ground, rather than forcing the Council to come to Earth or making humans go to Council space, and eventually they settled on a space station at the edge of Earth's solar system, and representatives from both sides gathered to hammer out terms. Senator Victoria Hayes led the human delegation, and she approached the negotiations with hard-headed practicality because she understood that mercy in war did not mean weakness in peace, and she demanded that Earth be recognized as a fully sovereign world with all rights and protections that implied, and that any future aggression toward Earth or its allies would be met with the same response the Council had just witnessed. The Council representatives tried to negotiate and to preserve some face, but they had no leverage, and everyone knew it, and eventually they agreed to every human demand, because the alternative was continuing a war they could not win against an enemy who could destroy them but chose not to, and that choice was somehow more terrifying than simple military defeat. Zarketh was removed from command, and several council members were forced to resign because someone had to take responsibility for the disaster, and new leadership emerged that was more pragmatic and less arrogant, and they understood that the galaxy had just changed in fundamental ways, and that Earth was now a power that could not be ignored or dismissed. General Patricia Wells worked with Lieutenant Maya Collins to begin integrating the ancient defense network with human military systems, and they discovered that the network was teaching them and that it wanted to share its knowledge because Lysandra had programmed it to help humanity grow rather than keep them dependent, and scientists found themselves understanding concepts that should have taken centuries to develop. Captain Nicole Hayes received a promotion to admiral and was given command of a new defense fleet that would protect not just Earth, but also other species who asked for help because humanity had learned from Lysandra that power without compassion was tyranny, and they were determined to be better than the Council, they had just defeated. Pilot Christine Murphy became an instructor teaching others how to interface with the defense network. And she found that while not everyone had the same natural ability, some humans could learn to work with the ancient systems in ways that made them extraordinarily effective, and a new generation of enhanced pilots and soldiers began to emerge. Months passed, and the galaxy adjusted to its new reality, and Earth began establishing relationships with species who had been oppressed by the Council and who saw in humanity a potential ally and liberator, and trade routes opened, and cultural exchanges happened, and slowly the prejudice and fear began to fade, replaced by cautious respect. Dr. Amy Foster completed her translation of the ancient texts, and she published her findings in a volume that became required reading for anyone studying xenoarchaeology or human history. And the final passage of the texts spoke of a prophecy that had waited 10,000 years to be fulfilled. And Amy read those words over and over, trying to fully comprehend their meaning. The prophecy said that when the stars grew cold with arrogance, and empires forgot the value of compassion, a guardian would stand between the worthy and the void, and if that guardian fell, they would be caught by those they protected, and together they would remind the universe that true power lay not in dominance, but in the courage to stand for others. Lysandra read the published translation and recognized words she had written herself millennia ago, when she had first arrived on Earth and had built the defense network and had made her promise to protect this world, and she had written them as a hope and a prayer that someday humanity would prove worthy of the sacrifice she was making. Admiral Morrison invited Lysandra to a ceremony where Earth was formally dedicating a monument to her and to Emberwing, and the elf tried to decline, saying that she had only done what was necessary, but Morrison insisted, and eventually Lysandra agreed and stood before thousands of humans who cheered and celebrated her, and she felt emotions she had thought long dead. President Carter presented Lysandra with citizenship and declared her not a guardian or a protector, but a member of the human family, and Lysandra, who had spent 10,000 years watching from the shadows and never allowing herself to truly belong, felt something break inside her in the best possible way, and she accepted the honor with tears streaming down her face. Emberwing landed beside her, and the dragon had been declared an honorary member of every military branch on Earth, and wore medals that had been specially crafted to fit his massive frame, and he radiated contentment, and something that might have been amusement, because after an eternity of isolation, he and his companion finally had a home and a people who valued them. The ceremony ended with a display of fireworks and light shows, and Lysandra watched humans celebrating their survival and their unity, and she thought about her own people and how they had fallen, because they had believed themselves superior to all others, and she vowed that she would do everything in her power to make sure humanity never made that mistake. In the years that followed, Earth became known throughout the galaxy as a world that combined military strength with genuine compassion, and other species began to model themselves after human example. And the Galactic Council transformed from an oppressive empire into a genuine cooperative organization, and the change was slow and difficult, but it was real. Lysandra and Emberwing continued to protect Earth, but now they did so openly and with the full support of humanity, and they trained new guardians and shared their knowledge. And slowly they began to build something they had thought impossible, which was a legacy that would outlast them and ensure that Earth would remain safe even after they were gone. Dr. Amy Foster worked with Lysandra to establish schools that taught the integration of ancient technology with human innovation, and the results were extraordinary because humans had creativity and adaptability that even the oldest races lacked, and they took the gifts Lysandra offered and built upon them in ways that surprised even the elf Commander Blake led Earth forces in several peacekeeping missions, helping other worlds resist oppression. And she found that the reputation Earth had earned meant that often they did not need to fire a shot because potential aggressors remembered what had happened to the Council and decided that conquest was not worth the cost. Senator Hayes served as Earth's ambassador to the Reformed Council, and she negotiated treaties and alliances that benefited not just humanity, but dozens of other species, and she never forgot that Earth's strength came not from technology or weapons, but from the willingness to stand up for what was right, even when facing impossible odds. On quiet nights, Lysandra would stand on the observation deck of the lunar station that had been her home for so long and watch Earth turning below her, and Emberwing would curl beside her, and they would remember the long years of waiting and watching, and sometimes she would wonder if her own people would have survived if they had learned the lessons that humanity seemed to grasp instinctively. The galaxy had been shocked into silence by Earth's response to the Council's ultimatum, but that silence had been replaced by something better, which was conversation and cooperation and the slow building of trust between species who had previously seen each other only as threats or resources, or obstacles. And perhaps most importantly, humanity had learned that they were not alone and had never been alone, and that sometimes the greatest strength came not from standing apart, but from standing together, and that mercy was not weakness, but rather the highest form of power, because it took courage to spare an enemy who would have shown no mercy themselves. Lysandra had spent 10,000 years protecting Earth, and she would continue to do so for whatever time remained to her. But now she did it not out of obligation or penance, but out of love for a species that had taught an ancient warrior that redemption was possible, and that even the longest night eventually gave way to dawn. The story of Earth and its guardian spread throughout the galaxy and became legend, and children of 100 species grew up hearing about the world that had faced annihilation and responded not with hatred, but with strength tempered by compassion, and about the elf and her dragon who had given everything to protect those who could not protect themselves. And in the end, that was Earth's firmest response, and the one that truly left the Galactic Council speechless, because they had expected war and gotten mercy, and they had offered destruction and received protection, and they learned that the most terrifying power in the universe was not the ability to destroy, but the wisdom to know when not to.